Alrighty, plebs and snobs. Today I've got something a little bit different for you. So, currently, my latest project I've been working on is this army that I've been making for the war game Turnip 28. Now, this war game, it is sort of in the like indie sphere, I would say. It is a post-apocalyptic alternative history. Takes place 1,000 years after Napoleon loses the Battle of Austerlitz, and a wild mutant root has taken over the world. It has corrupted and mutated all living organisms and beings. All plants are now part of this root. All animals are. Humans have no other food than to eat this root, and have all gotten corrupted in their minds by it, and now all see visions of these great old roots, and they have all formed bands of cults that they fight against each other for the cause of these roots, and also because they are starving and need food. And they are all led by these cult leaders known as Toffs. So that's just the brief little summary of what the game is about. It is like a skirmish game, and generally you're fighting with smaller bands, like 30-ish models in an army. And I just wanted to do a little quick showcase and say some of my thoughts on the game. So first thing, these are the objective markers that I've been working on. Now, these were just like a free little 3D print thing that I found. I definitely made a little bit of a mistake with these guys in that I base coated all of them with this sort of orangey brown, which for the carrot and the potato, the highlights look pretty natural for them. But it is an extremely harsh highlight for these more parsnippy inspired objective markers. Now, these guys were the first things I painted because I figured they would be the thing that I use the most. But I probably made a mistake in making these the things that I decided to experiment with. Like this guy in particular looks extremely ugly. But if there's any game that I think I could get away with making things look very ugly, I think it would be Turnip 28. This guy is honestly probably my favorite. I just like how high he kind of looks. Um, anyway, those were the objective markers. I think for everyone else, I'm going to go for a more classically Blanchitsu, very desaturated, warm color kind of paint scheme. And Blanchitsu, well, okay, first of all, these are just the toffs and toadies. This guy in particular is Todd. But Blanchitsu, I feel like, has gotten kind of a bad rap in that it has kind of become known as the like easy, grim, dark paint scheme, where you just slather things in Agrax Earthshade and call it a day. But when you actually look at the painted miniatures that inspired it by John Blanche, they are insanely detailed and impressive. And yes, they are, gritty and grimy and dirty, but the like level of actual artistry going on in those minis is just insanely high quality. Like when you compare those ye old day minis that John Blanche was painting compared to all the like heavy metal and just like the super bright, vibrant minis that everyone else was painting, it's like insane how ahead of his time he was, and like how the minis he was painting looked like they could be like tournament level today. But anyway, here's some more tops and toadies. Here's Root Lad. His spear broke off, so I will probably glue a gun to him or something. Here's the Turnip Salamander guy with a banner. Having glued all these banners to people first will probably prove to be a mistake, as they'll be like insanely difficult to just sort of move around and work with. I am not a big freehand kind of guy, but I figured this would be a good place to learn. This guy was the first one I made. He is sort of like the Napoleon guy. I chopped off his legs to make him extra short, and his arm broke off. But I figured that actually ended up being a happy little accident because I figured like, oh well, this is actually very Napoleon-y of him. Maybe his lore, a little bit of he saw some ancient paintings of Napoleon, noticed all great generals only have one arm, so he chopped off one of his arms based off of that whole Napoleon always hiding his left hand, right hand, or whatever in his coat. The jigging bread with a gun strapped to it. This guy might be my favorite. Good old Root Head, the Goat Surfer, big banner. That'll give me lots of room to make mistakes on. This guy is the two-legged horse. I've created some cavalry toffs and toadies to lead the cavalry follower units, because I figured it makes sense that these guys can actually move the full 12 inches that those cavalry units are moving, whereas I feel like Todd would probably struggle to keep up with a unit of bastards. The two-headed, one horn player, one drum player. You can cover all the musicians' bases for any regiment. This guy, he's the twin of this guy. He's got the front half of the horse. I guess they only had one horse and they had to share it. Another horn player there. This guy, he's got the high ground so far. He has never lost a toff off. I should say, so far I've played 2 games of Turnip 28. But yeah, this guy has always won his toff offs. The one that he has ever fought in. Now for some other units. Here are the Rootlings. These are from the Max Fitzgerald Patreon. They are quite goofy and fun-looking lads. Oh, dear God. Well, there go the bastards. Not bastards, these are the brutes. I believe these shields are supposed to be pavases for crossbowmen. Or maybe they are just big shields. But big fan of how these guys turned out. They have the little root sprouts showing up out of their back. Every one I just sort of gave a very, very bright white zenithal bone. And by bright, I mean just very much all over. And then I washed them all with a brown wash. Second unit of brutes. I absolutely love these shields, also from the Max Fitzgerald Patreon. They got the faces, a very common motif that John Blanche would have on his shields. These faces, I think they look great. These guys are my old guard for the grogs. They have onion heads, found those on Thingiverse for free, I think. Forget where exactly I found them, but I know they were a free STL thing. I created 4 units of fodder. I generally created 4 units of fodder and 2 units of everything else because I wanted to create enough units to be able to make enough followers to run a 2v2 game. They also made a bunch of movement trays for everyone. I know this game isn't exactly a classic rank and flank game where you would need movement trays, but, just make things easier. I gave everything 20 millimeter bases and everything to use the exact same base sizes as, the 9th Age Fantasy Battle, i.e. Warhammer, the fan-made edition, so that I could potentially use these guys for Warhammer. And, I like these guys. They just got helmets. I definitely made a mistake when I got the, I forget if these were the Austrian infantry or, the Prussian infantry, but their guns and bodies were all on one piece, so I couldn't chop off their bodies to give them the full bassinet, breastplate, chest armor. So I just had to chop off their heads, and then I found some helmets. I think were originally for Sludge, another game vaguely along the lines of Turnip 28. These guys, I believe, were the Prussian skirmishing infantry. They've got some mushrooms that I found an STL for. Just trying to keep them a little bit consistent between each group of fodder. These guys do have the full bassinet armor. I definitely do think I generally prefer how they look to the just helmet lads. And here, oh god, we're losing more of them. Here are more fodder. I will say, I originally put little pieces of sticky tack on the bottom of all their bases. But apparently, if sticky tack just stays around for too long, it eventually goes melty. Because these were just sitting in my room for like years and years and years. And then when it had gone melty, it just became like Laffy Taffy and stuck to everything and it could not be pulled off. So I kind of just smeared it into the bottom of the base and then set it to forget it. Now, this was like a tactic that I had used before, was just to use sticky tack to keep people on their movement trays. But yeah, I guess that is not a good permanent solution. So I think eventually I will magnetize everything. But as for now, just using friction and praying. Here are the skirmishers, the chaff that I've put on little skirmisher bases. These guys, whoops, I was just going to say that they stay on pretty well. These guys have got bows. They are just parry heads that I sculpted some green stuff heads onto. Second unit of chaff. These guys have crossbows. Again, more parry heads with green stuff. Yeah, is a snail knight. This guy is custom made. One of his antennae has broken off. He's got some bullet holes in him. And he's just got tons of shields on him because his whole thing is that he always counts as being in cover. That's like or like defensible terrain or something. That's like the rule that the snail knights work with. And, he's got a little sack over the snail's head. This guy's got a black powder weapon. And hey, this is the official Max Fitzgerald Snail Knight. This is probably my favorite of his miniatures. I think it has got so much character. This guy with his little fork lance, and he's just a fat tub of lard sitting in his little castle thing on top of this snail. The snail's got a very sad, distressed look on its face. I absolutely love how this snail knight looks. Here is a unit of bastards. This guy I stole from a guy that I watched on YouTube and his whole showcase where he had a spear that was just a musket tied to the end of a lance. These guys just have some chains on their back. They're horse heads. I really don't even know what's going on there. Some tumorous fungal thing going on that has replaced their mouths. Second unit of bastards. These guys have got the big ol' face shields, some reed mouths. This I probably should have added on later. The reindeer moss. If I were to do this properly, I probably would like soak these in ink or something of the color that I ended up wanting them to be. And then I would soak them in watered down PVA and then attach them after the mini was painted. But I absolutely hate sub-assembly, so I decided I was just going to put everything together first. Okay. Here are the whelps. These guys are on some Skaven dogs that I found on one of them STL sites. They got the black powder weapons, so pop some shields on their back. I feel like the Skaven dogs look pretty Turnip 2080. This dog, unfortunately, his leg fell off while removing supports, so he has got like a little bit of a peg leg thing going on. Just a little more added character. Here are some more dragoons, some more whelps. They've got some massive turnip mouths going on. I do, and they got some cloth backs, just some more added texture. That's a big thing in the Turnip 28 kit bashing world, is just adding as much texture to everything as possible. Here is one of the scuttlers, the giant crab unit. These guys just look absolutely awesome. Again, uh, due to my hatred of subassembly, these guys are going to be utterly impossible to paint. I can already tell. And this guy is already broken like 4 times just in the just in, like taking him to the basement because all these guys are just super glued on top. Which is another thing when working with all these resins and 3D printed stuff is nothing can get plastic glued, plastic cemented fused together. Everything has to get super glued together, so everything is extremely fragile and brittle and breaks and snaps all the time. So they're a little delicate, but they look great. I actually made a second one of these, but my dad has got it right now, and he's painting that one for me. He's a pretty good painter, so I'm quite excited to see how that turns out. Oh, there. Let's just bring this over here. Here is a stump gun. Again, there's another free STL that I found online. I wish I maybe like scaled the cannon up like 110% or something. These guys are quite big. They look a little closer to 32 millimeters, so I might scale them down to like 85% or something. Here is the Grand Bombard, and they have got some just Perry crew. Now, I realized they came with all these, cannon, whatever you call them, the ram rods. I had no idea how these were actually supposed to get attached to the minis because they're all just sort of standing around like this. So I just sort of glued them leaning onto the mini. Now, the Great Bombard itself, I realized, well, I bought the absolute cheapest bases I could find on like a, Chinese Alibaba Express type of website. And it ended up kind of warping this base from the like mud texture I put onto it, which is the first time I've ever had a base like this end up warping. I never had that happen before, but it's extremely minimal, so that's fine. Here is the Root Shrine. This is probably the model that I put the most amount of time into. It is a corpse cart that I 3D printed. It's got some bulls at the front, some skeleton bulls, pulling it along or whatever. Here's the Confessor. He's got a green stuff head on him. He's got a little dude on the end of his spear. I just thought it would look really cool. The idea of having this like root sort of like growing through all these stakes on the back of this cart. This thing is all air dry clay, which apparently gets pretty heavy. This is definitely like the heaviest of the miniatures. That bell, there's no way that could possibly ring because it is now half grown into this root shrine. I kind of wish that I went for the classic like curtain door and that super fancy crisscross window that confession booths have to like really sell this. But I guess this is more of a just casual, laid back kind of confession booth kind of thing. Just a little quaint little hovel that he'll talk to you in. There is another 3D printed. This is supposed to be a stump gun, but it is technically a volley gun for the Empire. These guys are like ever so slightly big compared to the Perry miniatures. I probably could have scaled them down like 92% or something. Okay, yeah, that's all the minis. Here are the black powder tokens that I had created, the smoke tokens. I used polyester for them because it was cheaper than cotton. But I do wish that I just used cotton because these guys do not take paint very well. It kind of like beads up and does not like soak into it at all. Also, if this was accurate to actual like gunpowder being fired, then these would be pure white. Because the black smoke only occurs from like the prolonged burning of like fuels. But when I kept these just pure white, they just straight up looked like big bundles of cotton rather than like smoke. So I did add a little bit of black on top just to make these look like smoke at all. Um, this is sort of my current defensible terrain. I think I do want to make a proper one out of gabions, the like weaved baskets filled with stones and sand. Here are the ordered tokens I had made just on Perry. I think these are the cavalry bases. They're just literal printed out pieces of paper on a base. They look pretty good. Pretty happy with how they turned out. Here are my bogs. I created 4 pieces of dangerous terrain. This one, he's got a frog on him. I'm kind of I've put in so much time and effort to absolutely make sure that they didn't warp. I constantly putting weights on them, and then they just ended up warping anyway, which not severely. They're certainly still like a playable amount of not horribly warped. I don't know. Yeah, if I were to do this different, I'd probably maybe invest in some of them clamps or something. Now, I went out of my way to not put any like reeds or dead trees on these or anything for a few reasons. Now these are like stackable so that they can actually be stored and not take up an insane amount of space. Also, you can just move units on top of them, and there's not like any part of the base that is like that cannot be traversed across or have a unit put on it. Love these little skeleton guys. I think my favorite of them is this Alas Poor Yorick skeleton holding his own skull. This one also popped a little crocodile in there. I think if I were to do this differently, I would. Well, for one, I went a little crazy on the ink that I put in the resin. I probably could have used just a single drop to get this sort of translucent color I wanted. Instead, I went with like almost like a full squirt of both blue and yellow, which had turned this into like a full-on nuclear green, like biohazard waste, which is fine. It still looks pretty good and pretty recognizable as a swamp. Also, if I were to do this again, instead of just like sprinkling flock on top, I would probably go very, very heavy with the flock right on the edges to sort of look like algae building up along the where like the water meets the mud. Last thing I sort of did was, well, this was even a thing that I was considering while I was making it, but I did not level out the terrain as, or like I did not necessarily put it on a leveled out surface. So like in this pond, it's a little sunken in on this side, and there's a tiny bit of runoff, like run over on this side, which again, you know, they're swamps. They're not supposed to be perfect, so I don't think it's a huge deal. I do like how this moss sort of turned out. It's just PVA mixed in flock, sprinkled on top. I like how the leaves turned out. It was just one of them leaf hole punches that I used real leaves for, you know, that proper fall color. Kind of lined up pretty well. Yeah, we got a dice rolling tray, and you know, this is my repair station because like 25 things broke just in the just in the action of taking all this stuff into the basement. Here's one of them official quick reference sheets. I've come to realize that these guys slightly difficult to read when printed out in black and white, but they do look very, very, very pretty. But before I had made those, I already, before I even knew that they had official quick reference sheets, I made my own quick reference sheet, which, you know, I think it's maybe ever so slightly easy, like slightly more readable on the black and white at least. It definitely does not have, it goes into as much detail as these quick reference sheets. I also created some pre-built regiment lists. These are my sort of learn to play guys. And then I created some for each of the cults that I conceivably have the ability to run given the models that I have. So that concludes the showcasing of the Armée. Now I just want to talk about some thoughts that I have about the game in general. Okay. So, what I like. I am a big fan of. I think they had a very, very clever solution to one of the big main problems that I have with Warhammer, or just war games in general. They managed to figure out a way to combine both the rank and flank type of game with the skirmish type of game. In that skirmish games, great because movement is very, very simple. You just, you pick a model or whatever, and you just measure out a distance, and then you just move it that distance. Whereas in Warhammer, everything works like a vehicle, like a tank, where you need to pivot and wheel, and like just moving anything becomes an entire ordeal because you have to measure from this corner to this corner and look at the movement arc and the front charge arc and the angles of everything. You need to get protractors to measure if this is a 45-degree movement and if these guys are even capable of turning to such a degree that they can now charge these guys. All that stuff that comes with rank and flank stuff, very annoying. The skirmish movement is great. But the problem with skirmish games is that it just makes positioning like not really matter because since things don't have ranks, they cannot be flanked and everything is in a 360 degree view. So you can't get behind people and get advantages for positioning your own guys behind their guys. There is cover, but cover has its own whole problem where I can think of a million times playing Mordheim and having to get down on the table and looking at my model and trying to check line of sight and having to get out the laser pointers to see, well, does he just see the tip of his wing? What does that count as? Is this 3/4 cover? Is this half cover, full cover, light cover? And it's just every single shot ever becomes like a little annoying, potential disagreement between you and your opponent. And I definitely prefer a game where everything feels more objective, rather than having to, if we were playing this in a real setting, having to call over a judge or something to determine what level of cover a unit has. But this game fixes that, so yeah, you have all the skirmish movement, but there is actually an advantage to flanking things because all units have little snobs hiding behind them. And you want to be able to kill people's snobs to prevent them from being able to command the unit. So there is actually an advantage to getting behind someone and attacking them from the back. So yeah, I just think that is a very clever, very elegant solution to being able to get the best parts of the skirmish gameplay, the movement, and the best parts of the rank and flank game of positioning actually matters. And that, I just huge fan. Also, really big fan of this game being an activation game rather than an I go, you go game. The I go, you go, basically, I take my whole turn, I move all my guys, I shoot with all my guys, I melee with all my guys, and then you do everything. You do all your moving and charging and shooting and magic, and we just go back and forth. But that leads to some pretty big problems occasionally. For example, the sometimes suffers a little bit from that Yu-Gi-Oh! Alpha Strike problem of someone going first on turn one, and then it's okay, so I've got 3 cannons, I just shoot your dragon that costs 650 points, and I kill it on turn one. Great, your one big unit just fled the table immediately, and we just spent half an hour setting up the table, getting all the models out of our cases and deploying everything. And now just after turn one, we've pretty much, there's an extremely high chance that you've just already lost the game. But at this point, sunk cost fallacy, it seems like it'd be quite rude to concede a game of Warhammer when it's like, well, I still have like a chance that I could win. But generally, it just like really, really sucks to have just like lost a game before the game even started. And it just like it is not a rare occurrence when it comes to the I go, you go kind of game. But the activation definitely solves that. It's just like, well, I activate one of my units and then you activate one of your units. So we're never going to end up in a situation where I just do everything before you ever even get a chance to make a single move. Warhammer also kind of suffers from that problem of occasionally it can feel like the game is like the most important thing that can occur in a game of Warhammer is deployment. And if you deploy wrong, you can just lose before the game even starts, which certainly can also suck. Also, when it comes to the activation versus the I go, you go, it just feels much more tactical. It just feels a whole lot more like a strategy game. In Warhammer, it usually devolves into like, cool, I just move all my units up, you move all your units up. Eventually, our Death Stars will just clash with each other. Our giant like main units are gonna run into each other. They are going to fight, and we're just gonna roll a whole lot of dice back and forth at each other until someone rolls better than the other person, and then they're basically usually gonna win. And even in the like ostensibly tactical parts of the Warhammer game is they're like, well, we meet our Death Stars and together, hammer and anvil. I now have my shock cavalry, and they're gonna run around in the back, and then they're gonna try to flank you. But it's not even like I'm thinking turns ahead and like I'm choosing to do this over something else that I would be doing with my cavalry, because like 9 out of 10 times like it just is always objectively right to just hit them in the flank with your cavalry. It's not even like an interesting decision that you're making. Whereas in this activation game, you very much so have to always be thinking multiple turns ahead and thinking like, okay, those guys have shot, they've got their black powder token, these guys have already been activated. So I'm actually making a decision. Should I activate this unit? Should I activate my chaff to move them forward to block shots, or should I activate my bastards to get the charge in right now while I've got the chance? There's actually interesting decision. Like in Warhammer, most of the time after deployment, like most of the decisions have already been made for you over the course of the rest of the game. But in this game, at least, like, I would say more than 50% of the time, like 60% of the time, maybe, when it is your turn, you usually have multiple snobs left that need to be activated. And you're usually actually making an interesting choice on your turn based on the actual given situation at hand and the position of troops and what has occurred in the game so far. So, core gameplay wise, I think this game just does a whole lot better of a job than a lot of the war games that I have played in the past. Another thing that I really, really like about this game that I think kind of solves some problems that I have with Warhammer. So, in this game, you never have units that get locked in melee combat for multiple turns on end. Whereas in Warhammer, this is a pretty frequent thing that happens. Because in this game, when people end up in melee, it always, always, always ends in either a unit getting wiped out or a unit retreating. So you never end up with units being left fighting in melee, which in Warhammer, this gets kind of awkward because occasionally you will end up in a situation where these two units have charged and like they are fighting each other, and then another unit comes in and they charge, and then they end up on the flank of this unit, and then like another unit charges and like they end up on like the flank of this unit, and you can sometimes just get in these very unnatural, like this is kind of like a hyperbolic situation. I don't think I've ever seen it get like this bad in a game of like Warhammer, but you'll just like occasionally end up in these extremely unnatural and weird like Tetris game, like just mangled messes of melees where in this entire unit, only like two guys are fighting. Where, like, naturally, I imagine in melee combat, it seems more often than not like people would be blobbing together and as many people fighting against each other as possible. Um, so I do like that they've just gotten rid of this happening entirely. Generally, the rules have just been like greatly simplified compared to other war games, all of which I am a fan of because like there's just so many complexities in a game like Warhammer, where I do often feel like I've never actually played a game correctly all the way through. I've always either forgotten some rules or made some mistake regarding something at some point. Usually, like many mistakes over the course of a game. But I feel like Turnip 28 is actually simple enough that I could play an entire game without getting like multiple rules wrong. So yeah, the simplicity, huge fan of that. So, what are some things that I am not so hot on in the game? So generally, I have some very mixed feelings when it comes to blunders. So in this game, there's its unique, special, standout thing that really keeps it apart from other games is the idea of the blunder mechanic. That when you order your units, every time you go to order them, you have to roll a die, and on a 1, they blunder. And like the purpose of this is it is a way to incentivize you to keep your snobs with your units and to keep them alive and within command range. Because when you blunder with a snob, you just get a regular little ordinary blunder. When a unit blunders with themselves by commanding themselves, they get a scenario blunder, which is usually awful and devastating. And on the one hand, I do like that it is like a literal mechanical thing that reflects the tone and the theme of the world. The fact that these are all just starving, insane peasants that are just like trudging through mud and being commanded by utterly incompetent cowards, it makes sense that they are not very good at following orders. So I really like it as an idea, as like a concept of a thing in the game. But its implementation, I am more on. For one, it feels a little bit clunky in that it is a thing. It is a role that is attached to every single maneuver you ever take in the game, every time you order any of your units. And the vast majority of the time, nothing comes out of it. You are just rolling this thing for a 1 out of 6 chance. I do know there are like cults and rules that do interact with the blunder roll, but for the most part, it's just going to be like a 1 out of 6 chance thing. And I also, well, again, this has nothing to do with the game. This is not the game's fault, but as we were playing it, just because I'm used to other games, I was just constantly forgetting about the blunder roll and just starting activating units and then realizing halfway through, like, oh, shoot, I forgot I had to roll for blunder and then to blunder and then to have to, rewind the game state a little bit. I feel like it's got to be possible to sort of either reduce the clunkiness by sort of streamlining this, by maybe incorporating it into another role, maybe, and like maybe when you roll to march or charge or shoot, maybe if you get like multiple ones, that will cause your next order to blunder, maybe. I don't know. I do think there is something to say about like there is a little bit of tension every time that blunder roll is made. It's like, oh, come on, please don't blunder. It kind of feels like, and when it does happen, it is like exciting because it is like a crit in D&D. It does feel good when your opponent blunders. It is fun when your opponent blunders. Um, but I also feel like it could maybe be massaged a little to be on average more fun more often. Maybe if it was moved in the direction of a little bit more of a catch-up mechanic, because I will say when you are losing and your opponent blunders, that feels great because that feels like, oh, thank God, now I actually have a chance in this game. Another thing is, but on on the other side of that, when you're winning and your opponent blunders, it's just like, oh Jesus, like it's just like you feel bad for your opponent when that happens. So like maybe there could be some sort of like underdog rule, or maybe like there's some like haughty confidence where units are more likely to blunder if you're winning and you have more snobs or something like that. I don't know. I just like I definitely like the idea of it. I think there should like it should be kept in. It is a very unique to this game kind of thing, and it very perfectly matches up to the world. I just think it could maybe be streamlined because again, if you do incorporate it into another role, you're not removing that factor of a role being the blunder role being like tense, because now you're just adding another factor to these other roles that kind of make them potentially more tense, and the fact that they might lead to like a blunder. So yeah, I don't know. Either just I think they have the potential to either be more fun or to be less clunky. I don't know. I'm not a gameologist. So another thing that I kind of have been thinking about is the fact that lots of penalties in the game when things go wrong, i.e., both scenario blunders and dangerous terrain tests, lead to model loss and like model casualties as opposed to suffering wounds, which I can only imagine is an intentional design thing. And so I'm sure this is probably just as a result of like not having played a ton of games. Like, so for example, when you scenario blunder with your fodder, you, at least for the core base game, the Long March with a scenario blunder, I imagine most people are going to be playing more often than not. You suffer 1d3 wounds when you blunder. I'm sorry, you don't. You suffer 1d3 model loss when you blunder. And you don't suffer the regular blunder penalty, which is just a less good version of the order. So that means when you blunder with your fodder, it is generally not utterly devastating because you might just lose one or two models, and in return, you actually, if you're volley firing, you get to keep your bonus to shooting, which means sometimes when your fodder activate themselves, it is actually advantageous for them to scenario blunder instead of regular blunder, because then they are going to be getting better shots at the cost of like a single unit being lost. And then sometimes, those better shots might lead to you making a very vital turn, like that, maybe you get rid of a very important like unit of your enemy side. And for one, I just feel like it should really never be advantageous to scenario blunder. I feel like in order to on the one hand, like I get that there is some, by keeping it that way, there is some tactical decision making of like, do I actually want to take out my opponent's snob and force him to scenario blunder, or do I want to actually let him keep his snob so that he is forced to regular blunder? Decision making. That being said, I just don't know. I feel like it should always be advantageous to take out your opponent's snob. I feel like you should always be incentivized to want to flank and to want to attack people in the back. Another sort of weird thing that comes up from like this scenario blunder is like, free regular fodder. Sometimes it is actively advantageous for them to order themselves. Like sometimes they do a better job of ordering and commanding themselves than, for example, your bastards. Because when your bastards order themselves and when they scenario blunder, utterly devastating. You might lose your entire unit of bastards on like turn one if you get a really bad roll just off the rip. If you decide to have them command themselves. And that's almost the same problem as getting like alpha striked in Warhammer when you have 4 units in your army and you just lose an entire unit on turn one to a single bad roll. I could imagine maybe the first time that happening, haha, goofy little silly game, isn't it funny that that can happen? And then I feel like every time that ever happens after the first time, it's just like, well, I guess I just, if we're playing a 2,000 point game of Warhammer, I just lost the equivalent of 500 points on turn one to a single bad roll. I guess I lose. And I just imagine that will more often than not lead to just very unfun situations. Which I get, this is the goofy little silly turnip game, and it's not meant to be turned into a hyper competitive spike game. But I don't know. I feel like this has. I just feel like balancing or like taking away, like making those blunders slightly different in how they work isn't necessarily a making the game less fun. I feel like there are situations where you can keep the silly goofiness, and it ultimately leading, the more fair, balanced things leading to more fun, which, if that's the ultimate goal of this game. And, that's all subjective, and I've only played 2 games so far, so I might be entirely wrong about all of that. It is just my initial thoughts. It kind of reminds me of, like, Mordheim and what is it called? The random happenings, where they are extremely unbalanced and quite a bit clunky, and then it's just this like extra roll that's being added onto every single turn, but they have the potential to result in some very wild and very fun situations. So I'm a fan of those, and I feel like, I don't know, I just feel like ogre bodyguard showing up and then potentially helping whoever is doing worse or whatever. That just, something about that just seems like it's got more potential to be more fun than having the ability to like lose your important unit on turn one to a single bad roll. Which again, like, I feel like that's just, it feels a little bit weird that your fodder are actually way better at commanding themselves than your bastards. I feel like that should be the other way around. I feel like your bastards should be more elite and more relied upon to command themselves than your fodder, who should just be utterly incompetent. And I get that there's multiple scenarios and that's not always the case, but at least by default, that is kind of how it works. So I don't know. I feel like the whole blunder, and I know that there was actually like in one of the recent tournaments, they were experimenting with casualty model loss being replaced with wound loss. So I'm curious to hear what the outcome of that was, and if they're going to be sticking with that for the future of the game, or if they had come to realize that it is actually better to play with model loss. So, yeah, those are just two sort of nitpicks that I currently have with the game. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was how like list building works in this game. Now, by default, there is no points or anything like that. Everything is just you pick your which 4 followers you want and you pick their equipment, and that is the entirety of the army creation process, which I am a big fan of. That super duper simplified, very quick to put together armies. You don't have to worry about points and all that stuff, which sometimes if you show up for an evening of playing Warhammer and people haven't put together their lists already, oh dear God, that's going to be a whole multi-long hour process in and of itself. So I do like the simplified version. And I do understand that the game has explicitly gone out of its way, like it says in the rulebook, that it is intentional, that all you need is a couple of core units, and then all you have to do to play any of the other various cults is just switch out one unit, for maybe either the Crab or the Grand Bombard. All you have to do is just switch one unit, and then you have a whole new cult that you can play with. Which I get the purpose, is that like you're giving lots of access to lots of versatility to every single player. I just can't help but feel like, and again, maybe I am Warhammer pilled and Warhammer minded and have been corrupted, but I really like that in gaming groups of Warhammer players, everyone has kind of got their identity. Like, Joe, I'm the dwarf player. My brother John, he is the Vampire Counts player. So and so is the elf player. And everyone has got it their sort of strong, like, who they are within the group. Whereas I imagine in a group of Turnip 28 players, no one really necessarily has any loyalty towards any individual cult, because everyone's just constantly swapping out whatever they want for that cult, or to be whichever cult that they want. So everyone is just a sort of nebulous, like, Turnip 28 player, instead of having that strong identity within the group. Which again, I don't think it's necessarily better or worse. It's just like different. But I was trying to come up with ideas of how you could potentially just stick with a single cult and make it fun. Like, for example, I really like the Knights of Shellwood. I really like how dwarfy they are, and the sense that they just sit there, they do not move. They literally have movement values of 0, but they just always count as being in defensible terrain, which I think is, great, very reflective of the idea of the snails and hiding in their shells. And again, I just really like those dwarvy armies of sitting there and just shooting your opponent. But I feel like after a couple of games of playing with the Knights of the Shellwood, I don't know, maybe you switch out a few units. I imagine it probably doesn't take very long for you to figure out which composition of followers is your favorite. And then there's a little bit of fine tuning you can do by maybe like, well, this time I'm gonna try chaff with black powder weapons instead of bow and arrows. Which that just it's just like a little mathematical difference, and that doesn't necessarily make me excited to come back to the table and want to play another game of Knights of the Shellwood. Whereas, in Warhammer, if I'm playing dwarves, sometimes if I'm trying, I got a bunch of slayers, and I'm like, this time I'm going to try the slayer build. Or this time I got a bunch of gyrocopters, and I'm going to try the gyrocopter build. And I get Warhammer, they're trying to sell you a bunch of models, so that's the reason why they have stuff work that way. This game has zero incentive or desire to sell you a bunch of models, so they actively want to do the opposite of that, which I get. But I don't know. I would like to just be the Knights of Shellwood player. So I was thinking about how you could do that without introducing like point cost or anything. And I was kind of thinking about like fighting games and how they have like assist fighters or like tag in partners or whatever. And like the new Mortal Kombat game, you know, you might be a Johnny Cage main and just only play Johnny Cage, but if you get bored of having Scorpion as your tag in assist fighter, maybe you can try out like Sub Zero or something. And so you still get to play the same character and you still get to like have the fulfillment of truly mastering one specific kind of play style. But if you get bored and you just want to like try something else out new, you don't have to entirely drop everything you've learned about that character. You can just swap out the your assist partner. You can kind of feel like, you know, well, I'm excited to try out this new variation of Johnny Cage. So I was thinking about how you might be able to implement something like that in Turnip 28 with maybe Colts having like hirelings or something, and you can attach like a separate unit to your core army. So maybe if I was playing the Knights of Shellwood, maybe I could take like a really crappy version of the gutter snipes, the snipers, if I want to do a more ranged sort of build. Or maybe I could take like a crappy version of like the scuttlers, or maybe a crappy version of like the zealots from the root shrine that maybe get like you know, for the scuttlers maybe they have like a rise from the silt type ability that allows them to pop up on the other side of the table, or is like, or maybe they're just like not affected by the Knight of Shellwood cult rule that reduces all your movement value to zero. Which on the one hand, I do get that all the cults have a very strong identity, and I am a fan of like each cult doing their one thing and doing their one thing really well. And if you were to now give everyone access to the ability to do everything that every cult can do, that would dilute how armies feel and how they play, and like kind of reduce how strong they really feel in their like specific play style. Uh, but I don't know. I think it's at least something worth potentially experimenting with or trying out. Uh, and I realize that there are some tiny sort of things that are already in the game potentially like that, both in the pet adoption rules where you can like add the, you know, the ox to your army and allow you to move around your artillery, and or the mutations for the taster campaign where you can for like the prolonged games of the term 28 where you can add unique abilities to your toffs and toadies. uh yeah, but I don't know, just something like for the core base game itself. I don't know, that was just spitballing there. Last thing, I did have an idea for a cult that I wanted to try putting together rules for to make my own unique OC cult. You know, and the idea I wanted to play with was of the scorched earth sort of tactic that came up in that whole Moscow campaign and back in the good old Napoleon times. And I figure their unit, their special model would be like the petard, but not like the real actual siege weapon, the petard, but the Age of Empires version of the petard, in that they are just like a guy with a bomb that is like a suicide bomber, basically, that runs up and explodes. um, so, yeah, and I figured that their kind of thing would be like maybe setting up like fire tokens, like fire dangerous terrain, which I know one of there's the tank army that was built for Swill, or as a like sort of demo for Swill, one of their like they have like fire howitzers or something that create flame tokens. So maybe they would play with that, and you will like intentionally get behind your opponents with the petards, explode them to create these fire tokens, and then with your like melee guys, force the opponents to chart or to retreat through the fire to deal extra damage to them. That would be like the core idea. I also think that the petards should like particularly be really good against single models. Like they should be able to run up and suicide bomb a tank or something. Um, so when I get bored of the base game itself, I'll start working on some new original cults. Um, so yep, that's all my thoughts about the game. All my models being shown off. I do ideally hope to plan to create some battle reports for this game. I would like to record some of my own, maybe slightly narrative battles, because I do think this is very quick paced, and I don't think there would have to be many readings of the rule book. I think it is particularly well suited to that battle report sort of format style of video. So certainly expect those at some point in the future, probably when I have at least 2 cults properly painted up. But yeah, nope, that is it for now. I will see everyone later. Goodbye.